been there since, except for 6 months off to write the book. Sometimes I ask myself, what did I know going in to Iraq? And to be honest, not all that much. Now, I think that could be a misleading question. Someone could ask me now, what do you know about Iraq? And again, the answer I think is not much. Maybe, is that mine? It is. Well, that's a little embarrassing. I interrupt my own talk, so. What I was saying is, I think the same question could be asked now, and I think the answer again would be not much, maybe even less than I thought I knew when I was going in. In a lot of ways, I think that's probably the best conclusion that I've come to over my time there. What I think I learned as a reporter in Iraq was how complicated the country actually was. And I want to start the talk by recounting a few interviews I've had with some people that I met.
Okay, so the audio is better on the DVD. So that was his introduction. And what I'd like to play now is about 7 or 8 minutes, as I said, at the end of the talk.
Of change in the region. There was an ideological bent to the invasion that ran as deep, perhaps deeper, than the warnings of the threat posed by Iraq's suspected weapons of mass destruction or the danger of Saddam. If we can change Iraq, they believe we can change the Arab world. In the words of Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, the way for America to fight terrorists was to, quote, drain the swamp they lived in. The rhetoric, idealistic to Western ears, rife with century-old colonialism for a third world audience, envisioned the dawn of a democratic and just Arab world guided by a benevolent United States. Neither the Arab world nor the United States anticipated the ambiguity of Baghdad, and by extension, Iraq. It was inconvenient. Baghdad was once again transformed into an idea which stood for reality. It became a rallying cry, a field for others' ambitions and grievances, and a dangerous conceit they claimed to speak on its behalf. In the contest of perceptions, Iraq was passive, its future in others' hands. When I look back on the coverage of Iraq over the past couple of years, that narrative in particular strikes me. The narrative was the almost relentless determination of others to speak on behalf of Iraqis themselves. Liberation was one thing, to Americans, another to Iraqis. To many Americans, it represented the end of their struggle with Saddam. To Iraqis, it marked a beginning, one still being defined. The same went for occupation. Even the words stood on opposite ends of a divide. To Americans, I suspect it conjured up images of post-World War II Europe, with the Marshall Plan put in place to bring about a revival. To the Arab world, occupation means a far different thing. Much less Marshall Plan and much more Apaches engaged in battle against Palestinians in the West Bank. Democracy was no less a divide. To many of us, it was a vindication of the Bush administration, a decisive step toward a democratic future for Iraq. Perhaps, but I saw something slightly different in the streets of Baghdad that day 3 months ago when Iraqis went to the polls. I saw a celebration not over choosing a particular party or platform that would guide the country, after all, the essence of what elections are about, but rather a euphoric celebration of rights long denied. To many, the election itself was what mattered, that their very participation would set in motion a mechanism that would improve their lives. In some ways, the joy seemed even more palpable than after Saddam's fall. Iraqis, not foreigners, were the agents of change, of taking matters into their own hands. Do these two perspectives overlap? Indeed they do, but they remain different perspectives. I often think that we as journalists rely too much on authority, or perhaps more precisely their perception of authority. In the journalism that we've grown accustomed to in Washington, that may be unavoidable. The workings of a government, the debate over policy, and the nature of campaigns and electoral politics, the very logistics of reporting revolve around a certain relationship to power and authority. That doesn't, however, apply to foreign correspondence. We can define our work more broadly. In a way, the best of international reporting is interpretive. The best of international reporting relies on voices, perspectives, frustrations, and hopes, knit together by a context of history and its legacy. The best of international reporting relies on interviews. Through those interviews, we can avoid the danger of an overemphasis on officialdom, where people can define the story for themselves. They can allow journalists to say that we don't know the answer. Perhaps there is no answer. Perhaps the situation is ambiguous. That in itself is probably the answer. Those interviews, however, are the biggest challenge in covering Iraq before the war, even during it, and still today they remain forbidding. Iraq is a dangerous place, for Iraqis of course, but for journalists too. Newspaper journalists, many of whom pride themselves on working low to the ground, have begun openly debating whether or not they should carry guns, ride in armored cars, put more concrete barricades in front of their houses. We're cut off from the very city we cover. The psychological barriers are my greatest fear. They are the greatest challenge to understanding Iraq's complexity. The question that should be asked is what happens when we're ignorant of how a city feels, how a city responds, how it reacts, its very energy, when we make the same mistakes we've already made? What happens when we're forced to rely on others to define the experience in Iraq? What happens when officialdom tells us one story, and by virtue of our lack of choices, we rely on it as truth? Lastly, most importantly, is there any way around it? And I don't know the answer to that question, but the question worries me. I worry that we won't hear what's being said, and when we do, I fear we'll listen for the black and the white rather than the gray. And the gray, like I've said, is what's best about our profession. I think back to my friend Mohammed Hayawi. I saw him again after the election. He was a Sunni Arab, part of a community that largely boycotted the vote out of fear of principle. He was uncertain whether he would vote until the day itself. I remember him telling me, it was like someone inviting me to lunch. I can't say no. If I said no, this would be disrespectful. I sat with Mohammed at his cluttered desk, and his words poured out, as they usually did. I knew that the paper I put in the ballot box was for America. I know I was being hypocritical, but there was no other choice. He waved a cigarette between his fingers. The future of Iraq is a line that goes through the occupation. If you ask me why I was voting, it's because I want to find something to pull me out of this mud. He looked out his window. Maybe this is the rope that will save us. 2 years on, his complaints remained. Lines for gasoline in a country with the world's second largest oil reserves, less electricity than a year ago, the suspicion that foreigners were taking the profits from oil, whose production hovered at pre-war levels. But little else, neither past nor future, was conclusive. There's a wall that Muhammad passes every day in Baghdad, and so do I. On it is a slogan celebrating Saddam that's faded, a leaflet by followers of a young militant cleric intones being an enemy of the oppressor. Partially blotted out is another slogan that declares death to the lackeys, and across the street is a promise to Shiites' most beloved saint, Imam Hussein. Nearby them is a heap of tin cans, plastic bags, wet orange peels and flies, underneath an injunction to keep the city clean. Muhammad's views over what was ahead that day were like the wall itself. They collided and intersected, contradicted and agreed. They were gray. He sanctioned attacks on U.S. soldiers, but he recoiled at the car bombs and suicide attacks against Iraqi police and civilians. He worried about the growing sectarian and ethnic cast of the country, perhaps the most lasting legacy of the U.S. occupation. He was a Sunni, but did not identify himself as such. Sectarian focus to him was the equivalent of all politics in the United States being refracted through the lens of race relations. It was there, but it didn't explain everything. There's a word that I've heard time and again as a reporter in Iraq. It is ghamid, and it means mysterious and ambiguous. It's a word that has come to define Iraq to me and my experience there. It's a word that Muhammad uses often and understands well. I mentioned the wall to him that day, and he leaned back in his chair and he nodded at me. The future? Ghamid, he agreed. He puffed his cigarette and challenged my assumptions. I challenge anyone to say what has happened, he said, what's happening now, and what will happen in the future. He shook his head. He felt quiet after saying those words. Then his lips tightened into a smile that I think can best be described as ambiguous.
So it's kind of a sad day for me on one level, of course, because I've been hoping to introduce that man. Instead, though, I'm going to introduce to you another great journalist. I've known David Hoffman for 30 years, I think, roughly. We worked closely together for 20. In a newsroom at the Washington Post that was filled with very bright, very motivated people, David stood out for his commitment to original reporting and to seeking the truth. He had some of the toughest beats in Washington. He covered the Reagan White House, covered the State Department under the first George Bush. These were very demanding beats that he did with real distinction, and then he went overseas, and he was the Jerusalem bureau chief, and then in Moscow for 6 years altogether. These were the toughest and most challenging of the foreign assignments as well. And his wife Carol, who's here today, can attest to the fact that David worked pretty much all the time. When he felt confined by the demands of daily journalism, he set out to write a book. His first book was The Oligarchs, Wealth and Power in the New Russia. He did this while still doing his day job. After 6 years in Moscow, David returned to the Washington Post, where he became the foreign editor, and he was one of the people who helped hire Anthony Shadid in 2003, a few months before the invasion. David served as Anthony's principal editor for Anthony's 6 years at the Post, and got to be a very close friend, as you'll hear. And Anthony left the Post in 2009, right around the same time that David himself left. They shared sort of one last glorious moment, which is to say in 2010 when Anthony won his second Pulitzer Prize for international reporting, on the same day that David won the Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction books for his second book, which is called The Dead Hand, The Untold Story of the Cold War Arms Race and Its Dangerous Legacy. David and Anthony had a partnership based on mutual respect, and admiration, and a sense of what journalism was and what it needed to be. As I said, we had hoped to have Anthony here today, and it's incredibly sad that he's gone. We're very fortunate to have David here today. I also just want to mention that David is donating his fee for coming here today to the Anthony Shadid Memorial Trust, which is set up for Anthony's 2 children. I can provide details about that for anyone who's interested. I want to welcome David Hoffman.
You know, Glenn didn't tell you the whole story, and that is that actually in these 30 years, he was one of my mentors. And when I first got a job, offered the job of Jerusalem Bureau Chief of the Washington Post, first person I wrote to was Glenn, and you know, he wrote me a long letter back about what it was like to be a foreign correspondent. And years later, when I wrote my first book, I sent it to Glenn, and he became sort of a writing coach and told me what I was doing wrong. So thanks for having me here. Don't underestimate your own role. Listening to this video was very emotional for me because that last discussion there in which Anthony talks about ambiguity, and you notice he used the word gray a couple of times, actually was something that he had written about himself in his first book. His first book was called Legacy of the Prophet. It's still in print, and it was a quite interesting book that I'm going to talk a little bit about today. But in the book, he tried to place himself somewhere in the context of the Middle East in the late 90s and early 2000s. And I would like you all to know that Anthony was the son of Lebanese immigrants to the United States, Christian immigrants. Most of his family started leaving the Levant in the 1920s, and they settled in Oklahoma. Anthony's identity was something that he personally absorbed as an adult. After he went to the University of Wisconsin and got a degree in journalism, he went to Cairo as an Associated Press correspondent, taught himself Arabic. It was not spoken in his family home. Began to rediscover his roots, and through a long period of sort of self-examination came to write this wonderful book, House of Stone, which really is kind of a personal memoir of his journey. But in the first book, in describing a little bit about himself, he wrote, Islam, at least in the West, comes across as unyielding, blinded by its anger, and inspired by vengeance. Many Muslims see the West as equally inflexible. Both seem short on understanding. Through luck of birth and circumstance, I spent much of my time in the Middle East. Outside that relationship that was loosely us versus them, I typically fell into a gray area, comfortable with neither, but as a journalist, interested in both. Anthony further wrote, I tried to step outside the traditional equation. In hindsight, I was looking for the alternatives to what we have come to believe as truths, that Islam is one way, the West another. And I think that self-description says a lot about the fellow I'm going to talk about today. I certainly wish that he were here standing at the front of this table and not I. I knew him as a friend and as an editor knows correspondent. And Anthony was a kind of correspondent and journalist who pushed himself extremely hard. He would go through great surges of intense work, sometimes for a year or two, covering something so spectacularly well that he would exhaust himself. And more than once he came to me and asked for a little bit of time off. And one time he did come and ask for a year-long leave to write a book. And he said in his request, written request to me in a letter, he said, "David, I need some time to capture that energy that's so essential for creativity." And I gave him the leave, and a year later he came back and I said, "What did you do?" And he says, "I built a house of stone." And this book is the result of that year of rest and recharging, and it's an extraordinary piece of creative work, and I urge you to read it if you haven't. Those of us who managed correspondence abroad, people who were putting their lives on the line, facing danger every day, it was a real privilege. And it was the kind of relationship where you had these sometimes frantic and sometimes short and cryptic phone conversations, or you'd have a chance to, for a satellite call from Najaf or from Cairo. And those of us who were sort of alive to the idea that we were in charge of these great creative journalists in the field, felt ourselves alive. And there was some great joy and pleasure in seeing their stories and talking to them about their plans. And every time Anthony would call in, it was sort of a jolt of a moment. It's what you live for. But we had a procedure during the war years, the war in Iraq, that whenever a correspondent would call in, we would have a young copy aide, and the copy aide's job was to say, it's late, Anthony's about to go to bed, does anybody have any questions for his story, for him, about his story? And that one night Anthony called in, and the copy aide said, "Are there any questions?" And we had a really seasoned editor, a fellow named Ed Cody, who had served all over the world, spoke 5 languages, had especially Arabic, knew the Middle East really well. And suddenly we heard Ed speak up. "Yes, I have a question," said Ed. This caught my ear too, because whenever Ed had a question, he was really the wise man of our team. And his question was, how does he do it? And I think the answer to how Anthony Shadid did it begins actually in a long ago place as a young boy growing up in Oklahoma City. His younger brother told me that Anthony always was the leader in the family of taking his brothers and his 7 cousins out into the woods and the lakes to go exploring. Anthony would always be saying, "Let's go explore." And his middle school teacher recalled that he was the one in world studies who came in with these lengthy and beautifully written 8-page papers in 8th grade. And he also in high school was very competitive in sports, and when I visited the family home after his passing, his father proudly showed me a photograph in his study. And in this photograph was Anthony in high school in his wrestling uniform, in his classic wrestling pose. He was the high school wrestling champ. And I saw that picture, and his father told me about all the awards he won. He was the high school valedictorian. His father said he took home 27 of the 28 awards they gave that year, and was wrestling champ. And I began to have a clue about the striving and determined nature of Anthony's personality. It all began with this young man who wanted to be the best at everything he did. And this took him to journalism school, to Cairo, to rediscovering him, a little bit of his roots and the Middle East. And eventually he came to the Washington Post just months before the invasion of Iraq in 2003. At the time, he had spent some time in the Middle East, and Phil Bennett, who was my boss at the time, the assistant managing editor for Foreign News, ordered all of our correspondents, we had 8 or 10 in Iraq, to leave at least for a couple weeks right when the bombing began. Maybe out of concern for people's security and certainly the unpredictable nature of it. And a lot of them left. But one night at home, late at night, Phil got a call from Anthony. And Anthony said, "Look, Phil, you may have to fire me for this, but I'm not leaving Iraq. I've spent my entire life preparing for this moment. And, you know, it was true, he had, and Phil let him stay. And Phil, I think, much to his own credit as a manager and as a person who could see Anthony's talent, asked Anthony to avoid writing the standard stories of the American invasion of Iraq, and instead to try and write something different. And Anthony's assignment was really to write about Iraqis and what it felt like to be under the bombs, what it felt like to be an Iraqi in a darkened house with the walls shaking and the lights out and the temperatures rising. These stories were beautifully written, and as Phil had later said, they grew quieter as the war grew louder. Phil added, Anthony's 24 front page stories over 19 days soon became a counter-narrative to the blind and bleached certainties of the official story. Phil wrote, by moving Iraqis from the margins into the center of the story, Anthony delivered an electrifying jolt to the system. He subverted untruths. Anthony would become the first journalist to win a Pulitzer Prize for covering a U.S. war from the receiving end. He turned the other into us. During the first months of the war, Anthony's journalism was so striking that many of his colleagues at the Washington Post and the newsroom would come by the foreign desk and they'd say, who is this new guy, Anthony Shadid? He didn't know very many people at the paper. He didn't have friends. Nobody had worked with him at the local courthouse. And of course, they were all very curious because of the really spectacular nature of the work he was doing. So on one of his first trips back to Washington, I asked Anthony to get to know some of his colleagues by having a brown bag lunch. It was sort of a common way. People would come and bring their lunch and meet him and talk about his journalism. And on that day, at the appointed hour, the brown bag was to be held on the 9th floor of the Washington Post, which was then a community room, about maybe a little bigger than this one. And we had put chairs, a lot of chairs up, but a really strange thing happened. The newsroom was on the 5th floor. And I saw it was the appointed hour, and I got up out of my chair to go up to hear Anthony talk, and I realized the entire newsroom, like 300 people, all got up, left their terminals, left what they were doing, dropped the hot news of the moment, went to the elevators, and went to the 9th floor. The entire newsroom filtered in and listened to this talk. There were people standing room only all the way around the room. And something then happened at the end of this talk. Anthony gave a good talk, as I recall, but what really stunned me was what happened at the end, because these several hundred sort of hard-bitten and cynical journalists who have been trained for so long to question authority, to doubt celebrity, to look for flaws, they all gave Anthony Shadid a standing ovation. And, you know, I've often thought, what did that mean that day? What were they applauding? And I know Anthony was somewhat embarrassed by it. He was very humble and self-effacing, but in a way that was exceedingly rare, Anthony fulfilled the ideal of many of us as journalists. All of us through our lives go through this profession frustrated at our, sometimes deeply frustrated at our ability to render the truth on a page, to find the right words, to find all the facts, to get the complete picture on the page. And this is what Anthony had done, is he had shown us that it was possible to attain a kind of perfection at this job that we all so loved, this profession we all cherished, but which we had never really succeeded at it. I concluded after that that this standing ovation was really because Anthony Shadid had become kind of a magnet for all of us, showing us that it could be done. Steve Call, who was the managing editor of the Post in those years, said recently that people of his generation and mine, who were approximately the same age, had gone into journalism motivated a little bit by the successes of Neil Sheehan, who wrote the Pentagon Papers story for the New York Times, or David Halberstam and his coverage of Vietnam. And Steve said that Anthony was, for the young journalist after 9/11, the Halberstam and the Sheehan of his generation. He was the one who showed the way. And Anthony practiced what is sometimes now called immersion in journalism, but I think he would have just called it reporting. He would enter a person's room or join them at a cafe, and he would stay on for hours and hours, filling up his notebooks. I've seen these notebooks, whole cartons of them, all very carefully organized, time and place, not a page wasted. And a colleague of ours, Thanasis Kambanis, a Boston Globe journalist, worked with Anthony, recalled, the people he wrote about were never subjects. They each were a world in which Anthony became engrossed for the entirety of his relationship with them, whether it lasted an hour or a year. And in my observation, Anthony's journalism was built on this foundation of prodigious reporting. And whenever he got to any place he was going, whether it was a Beirut neighborhood he was familiar with or someplace in Najaf he'd never been, Cairo, wherever, Anthony would record every sound, smell, sight, every scrap of detail, every bit of graffiti. He loved graffiti. Every bookstore, he would poke into old bookstores and see what old volumes were on the shelves. He would linger, looking for clues. Now, I once talked to him about how he would write this second book, Night Draws Near, which is the book he was talking about in this film, and about his experience in Iraq. And, you know, he told me what he was starting with. He was starting with literally dozens of boxes filled with notebooks that he'd tied string around. You know, he was aware that there was this great divide between East and West, and that he needed to somehow be a bridge, that he needed somehow to explain this Arab world that he had experienced both in Iraq and earlier and subsequently. And I think that as he struggled to describe what was happening in an Arab world that had been so deeply caricatured and stereotyped by the West, as he talked about in the film, as he tried to figure out what was really happening there, as he filled up all these notebooks, he reached a dimension that few journalists do. And I'd just like to give you just a little taste of how this worked and how I learned about it. In 2005, right around the time of this talk, Anthony was briefly in Washington, and I said, look, we have so little time together, let's go for a walk. And we used to love to do this. I remember it was very cold. We threw on our coats. We left the newsroom so the phones wouldn't be ringing. We went out just to have a long walk. I remember it was so cold that we stopped for coffee just to hold the coffee cups to keep warm. And of course, as often happened in these long walks with Anthony, I was completely mesmerized by what he was telling me. And I soon forgot where we were, what time it was, what street we were on. It was just possible to get completely lost in the descriptions that he would give me of what he was seeing in the Middle East and where he wanted to go with it. You know, as I think back about it, in his own quiet way, in a humble way, in a way that wasn't arrogant or know-it-all, Anthony was really spellbinding. Many, many journalists have been preoccupied with what happens today, what happens next week. But Anthony was one of those people that had a different sense of history. And as we walked, I realized that Anthony thought in deep time. He thought across great landscapes. He told me that night, 2005, David, the old order of the Arab world is collapsing. Mubarak, Assad, others, he said, the dinosaurs are becoming extinct and taking with them a whole system of rule and leaving battered societies free to find a new future. And as you saw from his own words here, and as I've told you, I think, Anthony was very humble before facts. He didn't know when this old order precisely would fall, but he wanted to be there in the very prospect. animated me. And from the time of his very first book, Anthony knew that the key, the absolute key to understanding this transformation would be the question of identity. Arab identity in a changing world. He wrote me a letter that year. He said, you know, by 2005, political Islam was already in crisis. Nationalism was expiring. Everyone was searching for new means of expression. And just as when he was a kid, taking his cousins out into the lakes and the woods of Oklahoma City, Anthony Shadid most wanted to be an explorer of this new world. He talked to me that night about 2 books he wanted to write. One of them became House of Stone. The other was to be a big book, his grand inquiry into the origins of this collapse of the old order. You know, it was so fascinating. We had to say that night that we got to a traffic light, and by this time I had no idea where we were. And I was listening to him. I remember he was on my left, and I didn't see this giant curb, and I tripped and nearly fell on the street, and he grabbed me and stopped me from falling in front of a car. And that sort of broke the spell a little bit, but it was that deep a conversation. What Anthony saw that night was the coming of the Arab Spring. He saw it on the horizon, and the thing is, he didn't get there by being a pundit, by having opinions. His journalism took him there, his discovery, his interviews, his notebooks. You know, he wrote in his very first book, Legacy of the Prophet, that after the old order collapsed, he said, the West must encourage democracy in places like Egypt, with the realization that it is, in effect, encouraging Islamism by making room for its growth. The choice is not sentimental, and without question, the risk of such policies is great, but the potential benefits are myriad. And when I read that recently, I thought, you know, not only in 2005 did he see it coming, but if you go to Egypt today, or if you listen to the discussion about who will lead the new Egypt, Anthony Shadid wrote it in a book a decade ago. After our walk, I encouraged Anthony to translate this search for the new order into more of his journalism, and he did. And he wrote a wonderful piece in the Washington Post about an Egyptian architect. Besides bookstores, the other thing that Anthony really loved were buildings and architects. And this architect was trying to create a modern children's park in the middle of Cairo, one that would be resplendent with Egypt's glorious history through various parts of the park. And Anthony wrote an article that sort of charted the architect's effort to build this park. And he wrote in this piece, in their despotism, Egypt's rulers have eschewed the brutality of Saddam Hussein's Iraq and the delusions of the Ba'ath Party in Syria, but have given rise to a plight no less menacing. Decades of authoritarianism that suffocates. A bureaucracy that abets stagnation and the malaise that provokes the most painful of emotions. Nostalgia for an imagined past. He saw the future coming. I'm very, very grateful that when the Arab Spring arrived last year, Anthony was there to see it. And he spent a good deal of 2011 for the New York Times writing about Tahrir Square and the events there. And he sent me an email about what he had seen. David, he said, some of those scenes the other day were the most epic I've ever seen as a reporter. It's a feeling we all have as a journalist. We're so lucky to be here. Anthony was that kind of a journalist. He jumped headlong into the river of human experience, thrilling at the currents, tugging and pulling. And amid the sounds of war and mayhem, Anthony listened to whispers, and he knew what they meant. When I last saw him just a few weeks before he died, we had a long conversation about that big book. The little book was coming out in March. Anthony had hoped to be here to talk to you about it. And he was already thinking ahead about this big book and the Arab Spring. And our lunch that we had on a day in late December went way too long, and his family was waiting. They had gone off to a shopping mall, knowing that they couldn't probably get him to break away on time, and we were at least an hour late, and we were 20 or 30 minutes away from the mall, and Anthony had no way to get there, so I said, look, I'll take you in my car. And remember, we had started to lunch, and it was getting late, and then we hopped in the car, and I started driving to the mall, and bang, it was rush hour, and we ran right into an enormous traffic jam, and my car was just inching along. And I was actually quite anxious about this. I knew Netta, his wife, and his children, and I felt guilty that I kept him so long on this long talk we had had, and he was calling her and saying, we're on our way, and I'm driving and trying to look for some way around all this traffic, and I was just afraid to look over at my friend to see the sort of anxiety on his face about how late we would be. And suddenly, I hear Anthony talking, and he says, David, do you think I could begin the new book with that Egyptian architect? I'd be happy to take some questions.